Okay, great. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Aditya Seth, who's a professor from IIT Delhi, for today's talk. Adi was my student quite a long time ago, and has gone on to do a great number of things. And today he's going to talk about digital participatory tools for rural communities, for climate change adaptation. And yeah, and I should also add that Adi is the author of a book called Technology and Parentheses This Empowerment, which I really recommend to anybody interested in this space. So thanks so much for joining, Adi, and it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Keshav. Thanks for having me. I was really looking forward to this. Um, cool. So all of this work, I started working seriously on this over the last year and a half or so. And it's with a large group of collaborators, as you can see, and many students. Too many names to put over here. Um, so this is really an experiment, really. I think it's going to tell us a lot of interesting things. One, a lot of this work that we're doing, we're ultimately building tools for communities, right? We want to put tools in the hands of actual users. And that sort of sets the bar very high that these things need to work. Only then they will be adopted. And so it's really at the cutting edge of seeing, right, is the data good enough, is the theory and the science behind the modeling, is it advanced enough that it can actually work now in the real world. I think another thing is that all of this ultimately has to provide some new insights, right, some new information to the users that we have in mind. And but there's so much, right, that we don't know, right? And people have been trying to work, and they've been trying to adapt to the changing climate, right? Indigenous communities have had many uh, sustainable ways that they have built up themselves, which we don't even know about. And so is it really going to add something, to beyond what they already know? So that's another thing that hopefully we learn through this whole process. And I think a third thing is that we're also trying to follow a unique method of building what we call the core stack. And I'll of course talk more about this. So we're trying to build it in a co-creative manner that different organizations, different researchers, they can all pool together. They can produce outputs which can feed into this stack and service new kinds of use cases. So this is also really an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. Yeah. So I'll begin. So I most closely identify myself with the ICTD community. ICTD stands for Information and Communication Technologies for Development. And so this community, right, the way that the method that all of us have evolved over the years has basically been that to solve some of these real problems, you really need to immerse yourself in the context. And right, so we do this in many ways, right? So this is basically, right, of course, where India is, but this is just a small part of India, right, where we've done a whole bunch of field visits to really understand what's going on, right? And we basically sit with communities, different kinds of communities, right? We walk around, do forest walks, and all of this to really understand what is the key problem that the communities are facing, right? And that sort of, right, just discovering this problem itself is a big a problem in itself. And once we get that, then that's when the real long journey begins, because then we start building tools, we and then we start iterating, and we see, right, is it really helping or not. And one of the first things that, and this is a very common, right, which really happened in our case also, right, that once we start doing this, right, even though it seems like a small part of the world, right, there's huge diversity. So one of the key problems that we communities talk to us about is around problems of irrigation, right? Water for irrigation. But there are very different contexts, right? So in some parts, there are farmers who basically rely on rain-fed agriculture, and they have small land holdings, and they're just doing it for subsistence. And they can really benefit from these kind of rainwater harvesting structures like farm ponds and earthen check dams. But just very close by, there are others, right? Maybe the rain is better, maybe the soil is better, and they are practicing commercial agriculture. And for them, the problem is very different. That they invest in high value crops, and they want to ensure that even if the rains are delayed, these crops don't fail. And they need a very different kind of farm pond, right? Which are lined farm ponds, and they actually typically pump water from the ground, and then they use them as storage mechanisms, right? And right, so this sort of just tells us, right, that the way communities articulate the problems, right, it's very different in these different settings. Similarly, the landscapes are also very different, right? Some have slopes, and the kind of methods for water conservation you may want to use are very different. In other cases, it's a very different terrain. There's also other unknowns, right? That this particular area that we visited, the community invested a lot in a sort of local kind of a water harvesting technique that they use, but it unfortunately failed because this area had faults under the ground, because of which the water actually doesn't stay. It doesn't percolate and help in improving soil moisture in the surrounding areas, but rather it just goes deeper into the ground. And right now, the communities, of course, had no way of knowing it, but some of it has been mapped by geologists, right? So there's also gaps in terms of are you identifying the sites properly or not? Um, then there's other, right, social dimensions also, which are very different in different places, right? So in some areas there are forest communities, and for whom they want to they don't want, I mean, many of them, they want their earlier ways of living to continue, right? So they're using like some of these very old mechanical rice pounding mechanisms, and the houses are all different. But again, just very close by, there are also farming communities, right, who are very proud that they built a farmer cooperative, and then they were able to install a small mini rice mill, and which they now use, and they're able to sell all of this in the market, right? So that's one of the right, that when we start thinking that what sort of tools should we build, it sort of puts us in our place, that the whole setup is so complex, right? There's so much diversity, right? We need to see, right, where are we, can technology really help sort of address such a diverse landscape? um, right now, right, so some of the goals that of course we want to achieve in this is that we want that right, community should be able to manage agricultural risk in the face of climate change. The ecosystem should be sustainable, and community should be able to achieve what they want. Now, to get to this, again, right, we see that there's many different things that need to fall into place. So so for some of this natural resource management, typically the development sector talks in terms of supply side methods and demand side methods. Supply side methods are where, let's say, the government can allocate resources for new, for, let's say, farm ponds or check dams or different kinds of natural resource management structures. Yeah. And demand side is where you want the community to sort of change their behavior and come up, right? But to enable such a good supply side allocation, right, the planning needs to be bottom up. It needs to come from the community itself, because otherwise what happens is, like this headline is talking about, that very often the government might allocate budgets um, and set targets for their field cadre, that we want to commission so many farm ponds, we want to commission so many tree plantations, right? And then what happens, unfortunately, is that the cadre are under pressure to deliver, and they then try to find out, let's say, right, large farmers who may have some spare land, and they would go and construct a farm pond over there, even though it may not be a good location. The farmers may not even need it, right? So it leads to a lot of wasted resources. But to do this bottom-up planning in a better way, right? First of all, the communities need to be informed, and these are right. So in many areas, just information about, right, what's possible, what can be funded, that itself can be a problem. Second, like I was saying, right, being able to find out good locations, right, which are likely to be good locations for some of these structures. And similarly, right, what are the dimensions of a check dam, right? How long would it take, let's say, for this check dam to get silted up, and it might require cleaning again. And these are all important things that can, right, if we can do something to help, that can really be useful. And while we do talk of informed demand generation from the community, there's also many equity issues. So this is just like a sketch map of a village, and villages even now are often organized like this, right? Or different castes living in different areas, their lands are different, the resources they access are different. And even though many of these demand generation activities are meant to happen in a participatory manner, it often does not, right? Very often these meetings are not attended by the more lower class or lower caste communities, because they're sort of they've sort of just given up, right? Uh, Due to centuries of kind of oppression and discrimination that's set in many of these areas. So even if we do think of these tools, right, it doesn't. It also requires a lot of processes to be put into place to ensure that the participation is equitable. Um, uh, and then finally, even if these demands do start coming in, how do you ensure that they're actually acted upon? How do you ensure that the government actually allocates things? And here, this is some work, I'll briefly talk about it later, which my social enterprise Gramani has been doing, where we use media, basically, we put tools of media in the hands of the communities through which they can demand accountability. And very often what happens is that, right, the local officers are where you need to find ways to get them to do what the community wants. Sometimes it's personal networks. Sometimes you use media as a tool to bring accountability. Sometimes you escalate to higher level officials who put downward pressure. So these kind of things are also much needed. Yeah. Um, then similarly on the demand side, there's very interesting different kinds of dynamics, right? So in the same community, you'll have larger farmers who are able to dig deep bore wells and pump out water. But depending on the geological properties in these areas, the groundwater levels can fall, and to such an extent that it can even impact drinking water availability for other communities, and other fields would also run dry, right, which often belong to smaller farmers. So all of this basically needs a lot of collectivization, right? That communities start seeing, let's say, water also as a commons, just like often forests or grazing lands are seen as commons. But groundwater is typically not, right? It's sort of considered to belong to the landowner in that particular place, and they can pump out as much as they want. But to now think about doing this, right? One big thing is that there needs to be, first of all, a shared understanding that needs to emerge in the community. Yeah. And this is how many civil society organizations do this, right? So these are, right, they would, for example, print on a large flex, they would print a Google map image of the village. And on that, then in the community, they sit together, they start marking resources, right? Where are the wells? Who does this well belong to? And so on. Where all do communities need structures? And they hold reflection exercises, right? So they'll ask the communities that what were the well levels here, let's say 30 years back? What was the depth to water 20 years back, 10 years back? And then, right, these kind of things are what are used to then um, enable the communities to reflect and potentially arrive at a common understanding of what sort of actions they should be thinking about taking in their local areas. Yeah. So this, of course, requires facilitation, right, to be able to organize and collectivize. And some communities do that well, some don't. So especially in forest communities, right, we've seen that over there is already a very strong sense of sustaining the forest. So these communities have themselves, right? They have what they call forest protection committees. These committees do regular patrolling. They have rules of how much firewood uh, can be taken out. If some household wants timber for some house construction, let's say, then how much can they get? And then there are fines, and right, right, the kind of nine principles that Eleanor Ostrom chalked out, right? You can see all of those in action. Yeah. So, so the main point I'm trying to get across is that along with huge diversity, right, there's also huge complexity when it comes to trying to tackle all of these issues. And that, right, so at that point, are basically all the kind of technologies that we've thought about, right? They just start looking at like toys, and it's really an existential crisis, right? That can we really solve? Can we really do anything meaningful? Because we might build the tools, but so what, right? If there's so many other problems in this whole thing, and that's really what the spirit of the ICT community has been through all these years, to sort of not just stop at technology, right, but to go beyond. And by the way, right, please stop me if there's any question or anything, because I can't see you. But is there any questions at this point? Any clarifications? Or
I think just one thing, you mentioned Ostrom's principles here. So that's all about common pool resources, right? So
yeah.
is there a metric that you're establishing for each of these things, like for water or for something else that is actually represented as a common pool resource?
Yeah, exactly, Anil. So that's the idea that, I mean, I'll talk about what we're trying, what kind of indicators and metrics we're trying to build, so that potentially, we can start looking at this as a means of building greater shared understanding in the community, right, based on these indicators.
Understood. Thanks.
Cool. So yeah. So I mean, this is basically, right. If we try to now break it up, right, then one of the things that we're trying to do, that I talk about, is that can we characterize the landscape and the indicators, just like what Anil was saying, so that we can think of right, what kind of action pathways can be followed in some location, and some other kind of action pathways in some other location, right? So that's sort of like a first cut. Another space where there is room for innovation, it seems, is that in site validation, right? That are these good sites for some of the structures that are being talked about, right? Then beyond that, right, to enable equitable participation, right? Over here, it's not just a tech problem. It's more of a, right, what sort of processes can we create around usage of the tech, so that the participation is equitable. And by the way, I mean, this is, I've just sort of arranged them in easier to harder, right? So this seems to be easier in the sense that a lot of data seems to be available, and models can be built. This is slightly harder because there's questions on, is the data at a high enough resolution that we can build precise validation, and sort of gets harder and harder. And one of the hardest then is basically just thinking, right, how can you actually facilitate this kind of a collectivization in the communities? Yeah. So if we go a bit deeper, right, so I'll talk about a couple of interesting problems that we're trying to solve. So one way that we're developing is that to characterize a particular landscape, right? Let's say, so we work at the scale of what are called micro watersheds. So watershed is a hydrological unit, where basically, right, you can think of it in this way, that if there is rainfall happening in that particular area, there is only one outlet from there. So it's almost like it's like a ridge, right? It's got ridges on all sides, and there's one outlet. There can be many inlets as well. And right, there's delineation algorithms which help identify this, right? So this basically becomes a convenient unit, because you can then study it a little bit in isolation for modeling purposes. So the idea that we're trying to work over here is that if we have these micro watersheds, right, then can we start characterizing that some might mostly be plain areas, some might be a mix of plains and slopes, right? And you might need different things, right? You segment further based on amount of rainfall, you segment further based on land use patterns, and then you start seeing, right, what are some of the vulnerability indicators in these areas, right? And once we're able to do this, then at that point we start talking to organizations or working in some of these different areas, right? Implementation organizations, CSOs, and we start working with them that in this kind of an area, why are you following this practice? In some other area, why are you following some other practice? So that can similarly, right, we can possibly also go down to understanding what kind of indigenous practices are followed in different areas. So the hope is that this might help us build essentially a at scale it'll help us build some kind of a classification system that we might be able to see what sort of actions can we recommend both to the community as well as to government administrators, that what kind of activities could be funded in these areas. Yeah. Um, right, so just very quickly, right, there's a cute algorithm, right, which basically sees that for any point, what is its elevation with respect to an immediate neighborhood, and then what is this elevation with respect to a much wider neighborhood. So essentially this basically is called the topological position index, that what's your position in the elevation in your immediate neighborhood and in a broader neighborhood. And this kind of an algorithm can be applied on data sets which are called digital elevation models, which basically tell you the height of each pixel. Yeah, the elevation of each pixel, right? And uh, and based on that, you can have a 2x2 sort of a simple matrix, right, where you're able to identify sharp hilltops and deep valleys versus shallow valleys and plateaus, right, small plateaus, and differentiate between plain areas and slopes. So what we basically did is just very simple, right? We look at so this particular area is a what's called a sub district, right? So let's say it's about 10 km by 10 km. That's sort of the broad dimension, and these are micro watersheds of 500 to 1,000 hectares. So we're able to then classify that which of these areas are mostly plain areas, which are a mix of plains and slopes and so on. So this sort of gives us a starting point, right, to characterize. Then we do some simple unsupervised learning to understand the cropping intensity, right? This becomes an important variable which tells us, right? So cropping intensity is basically in an area, especially if it's rain-fed agriculture. So in India, the common pattern in most areas is that there's a southwest monsoon that comes during July to August, and it is during that period that there's rain, and rain-fed agriculture can be done in that season. Now, in the immediate next post-monsoon season, and then in the following summer season, right? So we normally think in terms of these three seasons. Monsoon is Kharif, and then where communities which are just doing rain-fed agriculture, they are able to plant only one crop in a year, right? And that we're able to sort of infer based on vegetation index time series. And areas which are able to also have irrigation during the post-monsoon season. Over there, we're able to see typically two peaks, right? That there's two crops being grown. And then there are areas which are doing more commercial agriculture that have even better irrigation facilities, who are able to do triple cropping, right? 3 crops in a year. So through this, right, we just do we do this multivariate time series clustering, and we label the clusters based on this to come up with these kind of maps, that what's the kind of cropping intensity in these different areas, right? And we're able to look at time series, therefore, that how has this area changed also over the years, right? So this really helps us then distinguish that which plain areas have seen a rapid increase in cropping intensity, which means that there's more and more commercial agriculture happening, and especially if it's in uh, areas which are further away from water bodies, rivers and stuff, then most likely it means that there's groundwater irrigation that's happening in these areas. Right? Um, uh, then another thing that we also do using satellite data is we again look at the time series of different images, and we're able to see which areas have water during the monsoon season, and then a smaller area may have water in the surface water body left during the post-monsoon season, and maybe an even smaller area during the summer season. So what we do using that is we try to build sensitivity indicators that we try to identify then that during non-drought years, what was the area under surface water, and during drought years, what was the area under surface water. Yeah. And that difference basically tells us the sensitivity that that particular area has in terms of surface water availability to drought. This becomes not just important for agriculture, but also for livestock, because livestock, especially tribal communities that rely a lot on goats, for example, that in several parts, right? These kind of things become important for them. Similarly, we look at impact on cropping intensity, right? That how sensitive is cropping intensity in that area to drought. So then based on this, there can be simple rules that can possibly be developed, right? That if an area, if droughts have a high impact on cropping intensity and on surface water, right? And basically what it probably means is that that area has rain-fed agriculture and is seeing a great degree of vulnerability. And then you can start thinking that perhaps soil and water conservation structures are likely to be useful over here. Yeah. And you can also see how, what sort of structures have been funded in the past. And you can try and see, right, that is the funding sort of going in the right place or not. Yeah.
I have a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
I mean, this looks like very interesting, analysis of the soil and topology and so on. But don't you, are such things not already being collected by local surveyors and so on? I mean, this looks like something one might expect I don't know, the meteorologicals, who is responsible for this? But wouldn't there be a government body responsible for doing this kind of thing to create ground truth?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's not happening systematically, Keshav. That's one of the gaps. Both in terms of data collection, also that the data collection, right, any sort of on-ground data collection, it's very error prone and the processes are broken. It really depends on how good the government administration is in these areas. Um, and similarly, when it comes to use of some of this remote sensing data, then again, so in fact, I mean, we are talking to several government departments to use these kind of outputs, right? Because so far they're not really using them effectively.
Okay, thank you.
Just another follow-up question. So you commissioned the conservation structures based on these things. Is there any extrapolation of the projected impact of the conservation structures based on these models? So do you, given this year, if we build this many wells, this is what it should look like, and then evaluate what actually happened?
Exactly. That's really the next step, Anil, that we want to get to that point, right? And exactly to make those projections. Yeah. And also, right, other things, right, also factor in the future climate scenarios also, right? So that's also something that we're not doing right now. It's all based on like historic data and not projections. But yeah, both are very going to be very useful.
I had one other question. A lot of this seems like it's sort of designed per community. Are there elements of this where you're looking to kind of connect communities that might be facing similar problems or might be able to work on similar solutions? Is there like a between community element as well?
Yeah, I'll try to talk about that also. I mean, right, if we can also supplement this with information systems so that communities can share learning with one another, show examples of what one community has done and others can learn from it. All of that is going to be very, very useful. So that really goes into some of the points I try to bring up also on data visualizations and how do we sort of put this data in the hands of the community. Yeah. So if you just wait for one more slide, I'll get to that.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Yeah, and yeah, so that's the idea, right? And similarly, you might be able to identify areas where groundwater irrigation is in use, and is it excessive? Yeah. So over there also, we're trying to do some modeling and which has some way to go. So for groundwater stress, what we're doing is we're using this water balance method, which basically sees that in that hydrological unit, right, the micro watershed, how much rainfall is coming, which we get from different rainfall data sets that are there. How much is the runoff? Right now, civil engineering has developed many different ways of estimating this runoff on a pixel by pixel basis, right? That based on the soil type in the area, based on how saturated that soil already is with moisture, based on past rainfall that's happened in the past 5 days, and based on the slope and so on, right? So there are many empirical coefficients that they've developed. So we've implemented all of that. And then the other is water which is evapotranspirating from trees and crops. And over here again, there's data products for evapotranspiration which are available. And we're building a method to downscale that to fit to a much higher resolution. And similarly, soil moisture, which we're downscaling. So this is able to essentially tell us, right, that in that area, how much is actually, right? Are you in a groundwater deficit zone, right? So that you're just depleting more and more each year, or not. So over here, there's one element that we have yet to model properly, and which is we've not modeled lateral flow, which is the water that might come in from adjacent areas, and that really depends on the aquifer type. So that's one of the things we're doing to see if we can use calibration, or another method that is used in the civil engineering is basically a finite element simulation, where you basically divide this into grids, and then you try to for each grid we know the vertical flux, and we then estimate parameters like hydrological conductivity, that how much and how fast does water flow in. So we're hoping that once we have that, we'll be able to also give a precise sort of indicator that are we successively going depleting the groundwater year on year, and are we hitting into unsafe territory. So those are some of the things. And exactly now coming to now, how do we actually right communicate all of this to the community, right, or even to experts for that matter, even to government administrators for that matter, on what sort of should be done in a particular area. So here, one very interesting method that's used is a method called system dynamics. And these are typically done in a qualitative manner. So basically what it does is that it tries to see what variables have a causal effect on which other variables, right? That more intensification will lead to, right, more groundwater depletion, for example. And they model various things, that market access and aspiration of farmers and so on. A lot of it is basically done qualitatively to get a discussion going in the community, so that they're able to build a better perspective. But what we are trying is that can we basically do this quantitatively now, that if you're able to build time series of many of these variables, right, then can we actually understand, right, what is the system that's operating in a particular area. And then, right, let's say this is an area where you're living. What we are then planning to do is make a automatically generated audio to describe that landscape, right? So this, right, the oralization part is primarily inspired so that we're able to work with communities who might be less literate, less sort of ability in terms of data literacy, right? So we're able to describe the micro watershed. We're able to say, right, how tree cover, for example, have changed, and there might be scope for restoration, what kind of changes have happened in plains, and whether there's more droughts, and basically, right, try to understand, right, what sort of limits for different variables are being hit, right? And the idea is that we're doing it on water so far, but we want to later on, right, build a comprehensive model with forestry and agriculture and all of these different things built in. And we hope, right, that eventually, right, with after all of this, right, the main question, of course, is that can this help improve the community's own intuition, right, about being able to understand the landscape? Does it give them a perspective, and does it help enable some of this collectivization, right, so that when people are able to identify that, okay, this is a common problem, right, then we'll see some more convergence in the community demands, right?
I think,
So
sorry,
yeah.
I think, yeah, so this looks very much like an agent-based model, right? These arcs look very much like, and what you're saying here is that so the interactions can be parameterized by observations or time series data. Have you looked into agent-based models for this?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the techniques probably that we might end up using. Yeah. So agent-based modeling, I mean, in terms of either if we have a diverse community, right, then we model, right, different agents in that way. That's one way. The other, what we're probably going to try first is just at a landscape unit itself, if you're able to look at these variables, right, and how right, so what's the causal model, right, linking these different variables together. So I think that's what we're going to try first.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, but and like I said, right, so, while we're trying to do all this, right, there's a lot of unknowns. So we'll see where where we get to, but the whole point is that, right, how landscape are we able to really model through this remote sense and secondary data, or what other variables would we need to describe this, right, computationally. And similarly, right, how do we think about uh, inputting in some sense, right? What sort of indigenous methods are already being followed in different areas? So those are some of the wider like questions, and there's many other problems that we're trying to look at around this as well. That also look at it from an equity standpoint. That which sort of settlements in a village also, which sub-communities in a village have had what kind of resources, and new resources that are being provisioned, right? Can that improve the equity in the area? Similarly, we're trying to do other things in tracking forest health and so on. So yeah, so that's sort of the hope that right, through many of these things we might be able to describe landscapes and come up with action pathways. Um, I'll also quickly talk a little bit about some of the site validation kind of tools that we're trying to build. And this also connects with the point that Anil was mentioning about trying to do projections. So one thing that we try to do is to assess the impact of farm ponds. Right, and here we followed a very simple way that we basically see that in the in different radiuses around the farm pond, which also helps us understand what's the area of influence in which the water in this farm pond that's able to either irrigate close by areas, or it percolates into the ground and improves the soil moisture through subsurface flows. And it's in how much area is it able to influence, improve cropping patterns. And then we compare it with control points, right? Counterfactuals, which are basically areas which have very, very similar biophysical characteristics as the farm pond site, but where there is no farm pond, right? And what's sort of happening in that area. So this was very interesting, right? So we are looking at it by agro-eco zones. So India is divided into about 20 broad agro-eco zones, and already we are seeing different ways in which different kinds of impacts that these farm ponds have had, right? So in this particular zone and the one below it, this one, we've seen very good impact, that it improves the vegetation indexes around it during non-drought years, and a little bit also during drought years. But then another study, right, which these results have just come in a couple of days back, right, in this kind of an AEZ, where the climate conditions are very different. And here we see that these farm ponds are more often used probably for commercial agriculture. And over there, we don't see that same kind of increment. Uh, 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 Especially in other moisture related indexes. So these things, so what we're also moving to is that can we also build a machine learning model uh, which can give almost like a projection also, right? That if a farm pond were to be built here, what sort of an impact is it likely to have. And so this will, otherwise the kind of methods typically used in the field are more sort of simpler methods where different layers are put together and different weights are assigned to different geologic layers to come up with a score, right? But right, so we'll see if some of these machine learning models, causal machine learning models, are able to do a better job than these methods. And in the same way, right, if we want to do landscape level projections, that if 20 farm ponds are built in this particular area, then what kind of a collective impact would they have? Or if check dams are built, which would have a much larger area of influence, and then what kind of an impact can they have? So those are some of the directions that we're trying to go to. Then another is whether these things are being built in an area or at a site which will also be feasible, right? So over here, based on the slope, right, there are algorithms to segment it that in terms of stream orders, right? That which stream is combining with which other stream into a much higher stream order, and which then combines into a much higher stream order. So this sort of tells you how, when it rains, how the water will flow in an area. And then what we do is that depending on where different water bodies are located, we are constructing this kind of a flow graph that in general, when the water is flowing, it will fill up this water body, and then overflow will come over here. It will fill up this water body. So here we want to start answering questions like, if a new water body were to be constructed here, will there be sufficient upstream runoff to fill this water body? Right? Because this is one of the key if we look at many sites which were not properly identified, right? These were built in areas where these farm ponds or water bodies don't even fill up, because there's just not enough runoff that's coming in from surrounding areas, right? So here, and those kind of indicators can be very helpful for the farmers, right? Because then we might be able to also tell them that for how many days will this have water, right? And also look at the impact of downstream water bodies, that if something is constructed here, how will it affect, right? How much do these water bodies start filling up? Yeah. And so this basically requires simulations, and we've done so this runoff computation is actually a matrix multiplication problem. That's often not how the kind of tools that hydrologists have been using. That's not how they typically work. So so here also there's interesting things that we're trying to do to scale up these computations. But again, there's open questions that um, is the data resolution good enough, right? Will it work for small water bodies, or will it only work for largish kind of water bodies? And then other questions that, right, if these water bodies come up, who are the communities staying in the vicinity, right? And how is it going to impact the equity? How is it going to impact, right? Because this will trap runoff that's ultimately filling up downstream water bodies, and is there a negative impact on other settlements, other communities downstream? So these are some very interesting questions that, again, we're trying to look at in terms of thinking about efficiency and fairness trade-offs in this setup. And so I know I'm running out of time, so I'll probably go quickly. But the other set of things that we're doing is also building these applications on which communities can also provide inputs to demand these kind of structures, and an entire plan can be created for them, right? Which will give a backing to their demand. A backing in the sense we'll be able to provide a feasibility score to sites that they've identified. We'll be able to provide some kind of a justification based on the landscape that these kind of works will actually help, so that it improves the chances of these demands actually being approved by government departments. Yeah. So yeah, and so I won't talk much about this. There's very interesting experiments in terms of right that CSOs have been trying to do to collectivize communities, and it's very challenging. But let me talk a little bit about some problems that we feel can be solved. So these are now right social kind of processes that we need to create so that these tools, these sort of site validation tools, right, are actually enabling and ending up creating impact, right, so that it's not just restricted at the level of technology development. So here, a lot of experience really comes from a Gramvani, which is a social enterprise that I've been running for several years. So Gramvani, I briefly mentioned, right? We basically provide communication tools to communities through which they can voice their problems. They can right? It essentially amplifies their problems, and it puts these problems in front of administrators and other stakeholders to persuade them into action, right? And it works in simple ways that communities can, using just a simple phone call, right, on voice itself, they call and they can record messages, which we moderate, and these messages can then be shared back on the platform. Yeah, and right, but one of the key things, right, this is basically step two, right? All of this needs a lot of work on the ground to mobilize communities to be able to use these kind of systems. And we've developed a method of identifying community volunteers who are from the same community and who are the ones who then become our face to be able to tell communities about what these systems are. And it is the same volunteers who then also try to bring up these issues to the attention of administrators. And then we work with several partners around this so that these problems that communities are raising, they're forwarded, they're escalated. There's also focused accountability campaigns and things that we do. So so these are some ways in which we're the kind of deployment context that we are envisioning for these kind of tools, that it is through these community volunteers that we also hope to deploy some of these applications, that where communities can come, people can come, they can just take a photograph and they can go to the location, take a photograph and record a description of why they want this kind of a structure. And the volunteers can then key it into with some more details. And and then we then hope to follow these kind of processes to make sure that these demands are heard. The scientific backing that we've provided behind these demands is also used as a further means to make sure that all of it gets sanctioned, right? But of course, right, we have yet to really discover, right, what sort of training processes do we need to follow for the community volunteers and other kinds of challenges that we will hit when it comes to right, because these kind of problems that we've addressed so far have been very different in terms of access to schemes, but there might be more complications that we might hit upon. So so yeah, so just before I finish, right, as you can see, right, what we're trying to attempt is complex, right, and we can't do it alone. So another model that we're trying to build over here is, so I'll skip this, is that the stack that we're envisioning, right, it's basically building blocks. But we're trying to build different working groups. That so far we've largely worked on water security related use cases. But now we're trying to build working groups with different collaborators, right? So that we can build similar kinds of use cases on agriculture, on things like understanding what agricultural practices are being followed, what is the cropping diversity in an area. Similarly, do it on forestry and biodiversity, that what's the tree species biodiversity, what's the forest health like, how has it changed over the years, what are the effects if some parts of the forest are left untouched for 2 years, and there's rotational harvesting of forest produce. How do we communicate those to the communities, right? So similar data visualization, data oralization kind of techniques. So this is really an experiment, and to see, right, that can we leverage the kind of talent that exists in so many different institutions, and if they can all pool their outputs together, right? So as part of this stack, it's right, we're trying to put all of these different building blocks together in terms of right, different village boundaries, micro watershed boundaries, and then we're starting to work with these groups so that we're able to define specifications of what indicators to build, and then incorporate those into tools that we can provide to communities, and we can build processes like I was describing of how these tools can be used. Um, so right, and I'll also add that sort of trying to also do this at a higher level. So ACM Compass is a conference so it's an international conference that's happening in Delhi this year, and I'm also serving as co-chair. So one very new initiative that we're trying to do is so we're calling it RICS, Research to Impact Collaboratives. So the idea behind the RICS is that we want to build working groups that bring together researchers, and very much like what we're seeing over here, right? That Well Labs is an environment research organization. We're trying to bring some of the computational aspects. FES, Vasan, and Pradhan are organizations working on the ground, implementation partners, and Magasur also. CEW is a policy think tank. So that's sort of been the inspiration behind these RICs, that if you're able to bring these groups of people together and work on targeted research agendas, um, uh, uh, then can we address not just these kind of problems, but many others, right? Uh, so there's been a very nice set of RICs that have come together, and we'll be all meeting at Compass, these are RICs on use of IoTs in agriculture. There's RICs around use of LLMs in health, LLMs for government schemes. The core stack that we're doing is also a RIC in this setup. So we'll see how this whole thing goes. But the hope is that this will hopefully translate research to creating impact at scale by bringing all of these different diverse groups together, and it will serve as a catalytic space for innovating. Um, so I'll stop now. Right, so the main points basically that I wanted to get across is that development is complex, and it's not just technology, right? It's people. A lot of places where we can contribute, many unknowns. And it's also going to be interesting to see how we can build this kind of a co-creation network. Yeah. So I'll stop now, and further, right, happy to take more questions.
Thanks, Hari. Well, we have time for questions. Is anybody in the room? Miriam? Yeah.
Oh, no, I think there's someone online.
Oh, somebody online wants to ask. Yes, sorry, Joshua, go ahead.
Hello. All right. So I have two questions. So I'm not sure if I should ask the two questions, or I'll just begin with the first one. That's okay. But yeah, thank you so much for the presentation and for sharing the motivation behind the bottom-up approach. My first question is about the volunteering effort. So I imagine that if these volunteers were from low-income communities, they would rather prioritize or spend time earning money first to survive and not do any unpaid work like volunteering, which makes volunteering work very difficult and well represented. So So this individual externality affects the public participation of underrepresented low-income communities. And so my question is, what forms of incentives do you give to your volunteers?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And we've been at it for almost 12, 13 years of iterating the kind of incentive structures and models. So there's many parts to it actually. So one is in terms of volunteer identification itself. That you're absolutely right that very early on we were very idealistic that we were trying to get volunteers from some of the most marginalized communities, but they had just too many pressures, right? Having, right, there was migration, so they would not be in the village also all the time. But eventually, the model that we got down to is a typical volunteer for us is somebody who's in their 30s, late 30s, early 40s. They're from the community, they're living there. They typically have some stable form of income, right? So many of our volunteers are school teachers, for example, or health workers, or people working with local newspapers. And criteria also that we then examine is that they're really committed to social development in their communities. Um, uh, right. That's one thing. Another kind of an incentive that is also very important is that the volunteers, we don't have them work individually. Rather, in a district, we actually build a group of volunteers. We call it a volunteer club, so that there is a spirit of collective action among the volunteers, and there's very strong solidarity. So especially we see that when we do district-wide campaigns, where all the volunteers in their own local areas, they're taking individual action, but they know that it's all contributing to a much larger campaign, and right, so that solidarity is also a very strong incentive for them. Plus the third incentive, so there's basically four incentives that one of my PhD students, she wrote a paper about it. So another one is on right, just being able to also improve professionally. And then yeah, so those are things, and it's not completely unpaid, right? We do have a small financial component, largely to finance out-of-pocket expenditure, like uh, petrol for motorbikes to travel, arrange workshops, and these kind of things, right? So but yeah, so Gramani, as of now, we have close to 500 volunteers spread across about 40 districts or so. Um, um, but yeah, that is, I feel it's an important model, because without that, you don't build local capacity.
Mm-mm. Thank you. I will let the other members of the group to ask question. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Amelia, you want to go ahead?
I guess separately, I thought it was really cool, the way that you have this system that you have for communities kind of proposing projects, and then you can augment it with like feasibility information and project impact, and that seems like a really cool way of amplifying community voices. I was really interested in the question that you posed about, does this improve the community's own intuitive understanding about their landscape? And I was wondering how you had assessed that and what you had found, if you have any results on that.
Yeah, no, it's just early days for us, so we've not found anything as such. But we're working. So there's a design researcher in our team, and a postdoc, Vikram, who's collaborating with us from the University of Saarland. So we are basically trying to design experiments around this, of looking at these data visualizations, seeing first of all, right, are communities able to learn from the data, and right, so that's where we sort of look at, are they able to interpret the data correctly or not, and then second, at the next level, right, what do the communities from their own understanding, what do they think they need, and is that what the data is also saying that they need. So those are some of the ways that we're sort of trying to systematically understand. But yeah, I mean, it'll only be when we actually start doing it that we'll know for sure.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions in the room?
I think Patrick got a question.
Good. One question, I was looking at the core stack kind of website, and there's a lot of things on there for there's like a draft technical manual for the data layers and kind of the different products that you're producing. I was wondering, one, if you thought about kind of for that infrastructure, is that sort of thing going to be made kind of machine readable or machine produced to allow others to then kind of use your data sets, knowing that, for example, this particular image is at a certain resolution, because this is some of the problems that we have when we're doing this kind of work. And then kind of moreover on top of that, it's kind of linked. I think that there's a bit in there about the data hosting being a kind of part of the stack that's going to come, but at the moment it's a lot of Google Drive and GitHub hosting. Wondering kind of how far along that's come, because again, it's something that we're kind of in the same space of, or at least thinking about similar ideas and how to make that very accessible for lots of different people, and then how to handle things like licensing and all these sorts of things that then come with that. Wondering just any thoughts on those things.
Yeah, I wasn't able to very clearly hear everything you said, but I think I got the main gist. So yeah, so I mean, this is all evolving. Um, uh, uh, the data sets that right, so there's part of the data sets that we're producing, and we're trying to put up all these assets on Google Earth Engine. So that's one place, and then. Also, we're running our own these geo database servers, right? So we use GeoServer, and we've set it up in a horizontally scalable manner. So anyone who just needs the data sets, they can download them. So actually, we're thinking in terms of these layers, right? At the base, we have data sets, most of which are raster data sets. And then we've identified different vector boundaries, like micro watershed or watershed boundaries, which we want to then standardize. Similarly, administrative boundaries like villages and sub-districts and districts and so on. And then we compute indicators on these village boundaries, right? Indicators using the raster data, which are computed on these vector boundaries, and which are time series based, right? So so that making those indicators available, that's yet another kind of a data set, and which can also be made available through APIs. And then it is these and the indicators are basically algorithms. So we're trying to version everything, that as we come up with different, different method of calculating something, right? So we'll version everything. So yeah, so overall this is still work in progress, but that's sort of the vision behind it, right? That there's a standard way in which we're publishing data sets and indicators, and this is really what we will need, so that everybody else is also able to pool their outputs together, right? So let's say some other group is working on agriculture or whatever, right? But as long as they follow the same standards, their outputs can also be used across the board. So those are some of the key aspects. We've not thought a lot on any sort of licensing so far. I mean, these are largely geospatial data sets, and just making it available openly. There's like tricky issues that will come up once we look especially into the agriculture kind of area, right? That if you're able to monitor each individual farm plot and publish that information openly, and that can also be misused in the sense that traders and so on can sort of leverage that information and manipulate market prices. But we've not thought ahead that much, right? But those are some things to further reflect on. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I think we are a bit over time, so let's stop with that. Let's thank Ali again.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, and look forward to meeting with you again sometime soon, I hope. But excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ali, do you have time for a quick follow-up chat? Just have to.
Yeah.
I think
Sure.
Just to follow up on that data management thing, if you have time for a quick chat now, just.
Yeah. I'll end this meeting and then you guys can, so, Anil will contact you via email, I suppose, with the.
I'll just probably email out the new Zoom link.
Yeah.